Mr. Tucket, Chapter 7. No, Mr. Tucket, that isn't quite the way it's done. It was the first time Mr. Grimes used a long, drawn-out negative answer to something Francis had messed up, but it wasn't to be the last. In fact, he would use that long no, as Francis thought of it, about 10 times to every short nod, which was the way the mountain man approved of anything. It was the afternoon of the day Francis and Mr. Grimes had met at the stream. Francis had just loaded and fired his gun as instructed by Mr. Grimes. He felt he'd done all right. A piece of wood more than 30 yards distant had turned to splinters with his shot, and it had been the piece of wood he was shooting at. "What did I do wrong?" he asked. "I hit the piece of wood, didn't I?" There was just a thin bit of annoyance in his voice. Mr. Grimes smiled and hooked his right hand in the back of his neck, stretching. "Well, now, that's just about what everybody says when they don't know about rifles," he mimicked Francis. "I hit the piece of wood, didn't I? And yes, you did, Mr. Tucket. You hit the piece of wood. But how many times more can you hit it? Go ahead, load up and have at it. Pick another piece of wood out there and hit it for me, will you?" Francis loaded, aimed, and fired at a buffalo chip about 40 yards away. He missed. He tried twice more and missed both times. Mr. Grimes nodded. "It's this way. You're holding that thing like it's a rag doll. Your arms are loose and you're slopping your cheek against the stock. You're grabbing with your hands, and that's all wrong. You'll hit once or twice that way if you're lucky, but the real trick of shooting a decent gun is to be able to put about 4 out of 5 balls in the same place, or nearly so. Now, Mr. Tucket, we'll see if we can't do a little reshaping of that crippled body of yours." He wasn't fooling. In the next 5 minutes, Francis felt as though both his arms had been broken. Mr. Grimes pulled Francis's right elbow up so high the shoulder popped, and he jerked the left elbow down directly beneath the barrel of the rifle. "And don't grab with that left hand on the stock. Just make a baby cradle with your fingers. Let the rifle sleep in it." Francis nodded. It hurt, standing that way, but he could see how it made for some consistent shooting. "All right, Mr. Tucket, load up and fire again." Francis didn't start hitting right away, but at least his shots were falling in the same general area. He turned after 4 shots. "How's that?" Mr. Grimes nodded. "All right, but you're taking too long to reload." "What do you mean, too long?" "It was just a couple of seconds between shots." Actually, it was more like a minute, but that wasn't what Mr. Grimes meant. "It's this way, Mr. Tucket. What would you do if Braid came riding up the creek right now?" "Wide." Francis blushed. He was standing with an empty rifle. If Braid, or any other threat for that matter, came riding up the creek, Francis knew it would take him at least 30 seconds to load. "That's right, Mr. Tucket. You'd be tied like a cow before you got powder down the bore. Every time you shoot, no matter whether you're shooting at buffalo chips or buffalo, you load as soon as the ball leaves the barrel. Carrying an empty rifle is about like carrying an empty water skin. When you get really thirsty, Mr. Tucket, you can't drink air." Francis smiled sheepishly. "I guess I've got a lot to learn, haven't I?" "Yep, Mr. Tucket, you have a lot to learn, but you're coming along. Now let's clean that little shooter of yours and try some rapid firing. That's what really separates the men, or boys for that matter, from their scalps in this country. Not being able to shoot fast." Cleaning the rifle was easy. Francis just cupped creek water in his hand and poured it down the barrel, swabbed it with a piece of patch on the end of his ramrod, then greased the bore. "Now this is how we'll do it," Mr. Grimes told him, fetching his own rifle from his saddle. "We'll have sort of a contest. We'll start at the same time, and the one who gets the most shots off while I count to 10 will get out of working tonight, getting wood and cooking some of the jerky. Does that suit you, Mr. Tucket?" Francis nodded. He didn't see how he could lose shooting against a one-armed man. "All right, Mr. Tucket, go." "But you don't even have your rifle out of its case, Mr. Grimes," Francis said. "You aren't even ready." "Just giving you the benefit of a little head start, Mr. Tucket. Ready? Go." They both fired at the same instant. Mr. Grimes had just flipped his rifle and fired, one-armed, before its buckskin hit the ground. "One!" he said, starting to count. Francis worked frantically. From his flask he poured powder into his cupped palm. Then he emptied the roughly measured powder down the bore. 2. As Francis was placing the patch across the mouth of the bore, he heard the roar of Mr. Grimes Hawkins. He couldn't believe it. He put the ball in the patch and drew the ramrod from its cradle beneath the barrel. He stirred the ball down with his thumb. 3. And put the ramrod on top of it. And as he slammed the ball home, he heard the mighty Hawkins roar again. Mr. Grimes had fired 3 to his 1. Francis capped the nipple, raised the rifle. 4. And fired, and his second shot tore a buffalo chip to pieces. The Hawkins belched a 4th time. It was much too much for Francis. He lowered his rifle and watched Mr. Grimes. 5. Mr. Grimes raised his Hawkins and fired. Number 5. 5 shots in time it had taken Francis to make 2. Clearly, Francis had missed something. 6. Mr. Grimes lowered the Hawkins and held it between his knees. In one fluid motion, he poured powder from the flask at his side down the barrel directly, without measuring, and brought the muzzle of the rifle up to his mouth. From his lips, he spit a ball into the muzzle. Without a patch, it slid down freely. Need no ramrod. He slammed the butt of the rifle on the ground to seat the ball, and from the space between his fingers pulled a percussion cap. It fitted quickly on the nipple, and the Hawkins came up, and 7. Smoke again poured over the grass. Mr. Grimes lowered his rifle and grinned. I don't guess I have to go all the way to 10 after all. But that wasn't fair, Francis said. You didn't patch your balls or measure your powder. Now, Mr. Tucket, the word fair is pretty loose. What's not fair in St. Louis at a turkey shot? Shoot, might be fair when you're up against 5 or 6 Comanche. He used the word Comanche off. He cut the word Comanche off. Out here, people sort of think fair, meaning the same as alive. Savvy? Francis smiled. Savvy. Fair means that I'm going to gather wood and cook jerky. You are coming along, Mr. Tucket, the mountain man said, grinning ear to ear. 10, 15 years, if you're still alive, you'll be one of the best wood gatherers in Black Hill. I hope you enjoyed reading Chapter 7.